The views and opinions expressed on this program are not those of Norfolk State University or WNSB-FM. Thank you for listening. Hi, 91, your choice for hip-hop and R&B soul. Yes, you hear my voice, so you already know what time it is. It is time for a brand new episode of Hampton Roads Voices. Woohoo! Kilo is here, yes. And we're going to have a great conversation on today. If you haven't noticed, I'm sure you have, all throughout the month of February, we've been kind of focused on issues that affect the African-American community. You know, usually Hampton Roads Voices, we do issues that could affect all of us here in the Hampton Roads area, and regionally and nationally. But, you know, for Black History Month, the first one we did was the taboo of mental health in the Black community. And then the second one we did, what did we do last week? I don't forgot. Oh, nope. Forgot again. And then this week, we're going to be talking about environmental racism. It's going to come to me. Oh, yes. Last week, it was blackface. Yeah, how African Americans are portrayed in the media. And that was a really great conversation as well. So this Black History Month series continues with very special guest experts on the show today, talking about environmental racism. Have you ever heard of that before? Probably not. And if you have, then you know it's very interesting, intriguing to say the least. So, like I said, very special guest experts with me today. I have Dr. Camelia Okpodu. Yeah, she is a biology professor here at Norfolk State University. Hello there, Dr. O.
Hi.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, and I also have Mr. John Sokolow. He is an attorney and an activist, and he has written plenty of articles about environmental racism having to do, and environmental injustices having to do with Virginia. And that is what we're going to be, coming from that angle regionally. Hello there, John.
Hi, Keela. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much. So we're going to do some quick introductions because I always like to I always allow my special guest experts to brag on themselves and to let us know why they are here, why I invited you guys here. So ladies first, Dr. O, we'll start with you. Tell us about what you do here in Norfolk State and how what you do kind of goes hand in hand with environmental racism.
Well, thank you. My name is Camelia Moses Okpodu. I'm a professor of biology here at Norfolk State. I also run the Defense Intelligence Agency's Center for Academic Excellence. I've been doing that since 2009. We started off with a grant from the Department of, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, and eventually we moved under the Defense Intelligence Agency. So what I do here is I try to inform our students and our local community, as well as regional people, partners that we have, about issues that we think are germane to our population of students and stakeholders. I study I'm a molecular biologist, plant physiologist, molecular biologist. So I'm really interested in how plants respond to the environment, but I'm not just interested in how plants. I started thinking about the whole ecosystem, and of which we are a part of it. So I started asking a question last year using the funding from the Department of Homeland Security. I got a special award. I'm a DHS fellow for 2017 and 2018. And so we started asking, what is coastal resilience, and how do people in the African American community, in particular, how do we respond to the environment? How do we see ourselves in the environment? A lot of times, people study us, and we don't look to get our own answers. And so I wanted to be able to have our student body work on this. So I'm the director of the SEEDS group, which is a sustainability strategy for environmental education, diversifying the Ecological Society of America. Anybody who's interested in seeds can join, so it's open to any major here at Norfolk State. We've been doing that since 2008. So I'm really happy to be here, and I got a grant to study this problem, and I think it is a fiduciary responsibility and a cultural responsibility to have our voice out there to make sure we get in the conversation.
I love that. We have some great faculty and staff here at Norfolk State University. All right, John, tell us a little bit about yourself, sir.
Well, thanks again, Keela, for having me, and I'm really proud to be on this show with Dr. Okpodu. So I'm an attorney and activist in Northern Virginia, as you mentioned. I've actually been a practicing public interest attorney since 1984, so I go back a little bit. So 35 years of practicing law just about, and 20 of those years, the last 20, I recently retired from working with retired coal miners and their families in Appalachia and out in the West as well, fighting for pension and health benefits for them, for the work that they've devoted a lifetime to. So as part of that work, I certainly dealt with the health effects of coal on people, the terrible problems that they have to deal with, as well as the environmental problems that are caused by that industry. I've spent a lifetime fighting for social, racial, and economic justice, been involved in a lot of different movements over the years, and turned my attention in the past year or so to what I consider to be one of the most serious examples of environmental racism right in our own backyard in Virginia, which is the Atlantic Coast Pipeline that's being proposed by Dominion Energy, and in particular a compressor station that's being proposed in Buckingham County in an 85% African-American historic community, which would really ravage that community. So I consider that fight part of what I've been spending a lifetime doing, and really pleased to have this opportunity to talk about environmental racism. It doesn't get enough attention, but it affects people in a very serious way.
Absolutely. I'm so excited to have both of you guys here because, we're coming from the sea level rise that is happening. And then the pipeline is, these are environmental harms that affect particular communities. And I'm going to bring this up a little bit later in the show. I think it's during this Black History Month series, some of these issues that affect our community, it's not just a Black issue, it's a people issue. So I think it's very important not to only have, African-American specialists here, but John Sokolow, if you can tell, or you probably can't tell, he is white. So
he is charged.
So, we need, it takes more than African Americans to get to these issues and to bring solutions. So I really appreciate both of you guys being here so we can have two different perspectives, two different projects that you guys work on and, coming together. All right. So 757-823-9110 is the number. And of course, as every week, we do want you to call in and share your concerns. Okay. So I know that this topic is pretty new, but I behoove you to please listen because this is a conversation that needs to be had. If you have any questions, please call in 757-823-9110. But I'm going to pose a question to you like I always do every week. What are some environmental concerns regarding your community that you have? Okay, so for instance, we know that Dr. O is talking about the sea level rise, and we're going to get to that later on in the show. But we know some of those neighborhoods that are really affected by sea level rising and flooding that gets crazy, especially in the the city of Norfolk. So those concerns maybe, I don't know, any concerns that are happening in your community having to do with the environment, call in and use your voice, use the airways to express your concern. 757-823-9110, 823-9110. We are talking about environmental racism, and we'll get into exactly what that is coming up in a bit. Make sure you keep it locked. It's Hampton Roads Voices, Environmental Racism on Hot 91. Hot 91, your choice for hip-hop and R&B soul. Happy new episode of Hampton Roads Voices, and this one is very interesting to say the least. But you know what this show is all about. It's about pushing the envelope, forcing you to learn something, putting the issues in your face so that you are well aware. Don't you want to be aware? I'm sure you do. So, environmental racism, that is the title of tonight's episode, and we're going to be talking about how African Americans and Brown and Hispanic, Latinos, communities of minorities are disproportionately affected by certain environmental harms. Yes, that is a thing. Okay, so I have special guest experts with me today. Dr. Okpodu, she's a biology professor here at Norfolk State University, and John Sokolow, he is an attorney and activist, and he has written countless articles about environmental injustices here in the state of Virginia. Hello, guys, again.
Hello.
Hi.
So let's get into it, all right? So I know a lot of people. Oh, and then, of course, I'm sorry, Hampton Roads, I want to hear from you. 757-823-9110. It's not a show without you, okay? Let your voice be heard. And I posed a question to you. What are some concerns that you may have regarding the environment in your community? So if you live in a certain neighborhood in Norfolk or Virginia Beach or Portsmouth that you experience flooding that is extraordinary, then call in and share your testimony, share your story. Maybe try to suggest certain things that the city can do or not do, something like that. 757-823-9110, okay? So even though the crisis is not new, Dr. O and John, a lot of people aren't aware of it, when they hear environmental racism. What in the world is that? So how can you describe environmental racism, I guess, is the question. What is the definition of environmental racism?
If I can go first, John, I'll just take this from a perspective that I think, first of all, what we have to acknowledge is that in Black History Month, one of the things we must always do is to acknowledge our ancestors, right? Mm-hmm. So if we're going to talk about environmental justice and racism as a movement, as a social movement, we have to go back and look to the sociologists because they are the practitioners who help us to put our cultural context, our what's happening to us in a cultural context. So when I was thinking about coming on here today, I started asking myself, well, who are everybody knows that Robert Bullard is the father of social justice, environmental justice. Mm-hmm. But what they may not realize is that before Dr. Bullard, at Howard University, there was a professor and chair of the sociology department, Dr. Frazier, who actually was the first person to ever study African American communities and how we respond in cities. He was from Baltimore, and he wanted to know how we responded to the resources. It was a resource issue. And that was in the 1930s. Oh, wow. Okay. So because he finished his doctorate from Clark in Massachusetts, and I think it was 1916 or something around there. So he came to Howard and spent like 30 years at Howard studying these questions, but he never got the movement that he needed, because you got to think about this in context of America, what was going on. Right. So environmental racism and justice comes out of the social justice that we were all, and equality we were looking for. Mm. Earlier you mentioned that our other guest is white, but I think of the environment as one thing that binds us all together. Yeah. First of all, we are all family, no strangers. Yeah. Because we breathe the same air, and John said it earlier, we have to drink the same water. Mm-hmm. The thing that I want us to realize is that Langston Hughes in 1938, and I brought this poem with me, talked about the environment to give us some foundation as to why this has always been an issue for us. Mm. And I'm just going to read an excerpt. It says, out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we, the people, must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain. All the stretch of these great green states, and make America again. Mm-hmm. Notice he didn't say great again.
Make it again.
Make it again. Mm-hmm. Make it again for all people, all. Not some, but all. And so when I think of environmental justice, I'm going to shut up because this is the professor in me. When I think of environmental justice, it moved out, how do we encompass that all that Langston Hughes was talking about in 1938? Yeah. And how do we make sure that all are at the table and that voices are heard? I never prescribe to malice what ignorance can account for, right? Sometimes we don't know, and people do what they know. What's the most expedient? What's the low-hanging fruit? What's the easiest thing for us to do? What we say in biochemistry, what is the rate-limiting process? We're going to make sure we get over that energy of activation so that we can get the best product. Mm. And so when I think of justice, we want to make equality, social equity, that we all have an opportunity to have a voice at the table.
Yeah, I like that. Thank you, Dr. O. How about you, John? What is environmental racism?
Well, I completely agree with everything Dr. O said, and I'll just say if you put a professor and a lawyer on the radio, we'd take up a little bit of time.
Good.
But no, she's quite right. I had told her earlier, we all breathe the same air, we all drink the same water, but we also do need to recognize the fact that what we're talking about with environmental racism is that there's a disproportionate impact on communities of color, on poor people, on poor communities in this country and around the world. What we're talking about is fence-line communities. That's the phrase that's used in the literature, and it simply means people who live near power plants, chemical plants, hazardous waste facilities. And it's not just everybody. It's disproportionately in communities of color, and there's reasons for that we could talk about. It's really, I think of it as a form of Jim Crow, because it's a product of Jim Crow. It's a product of segregated housing patterns. It's a product of racist policies and decisions that are made by corporations to take advantage of poor communities that don't have the resources to fight back, don't have the political power, don't have the donor base. And that's true very much in Virginia. Dominion Energy is one of the top contributors to politicians in both parties here. And they call the shots. We found out recently, wrote major legislation that was designed to regulate them on an issue called the rate freeze, which is a different topic. But these companies wield their power, and they use that power against communities of color. Now, are they, doing it because they want to target communities of color? We could discuss that. But what they're doing is in fact targeting those communities because it's cheaper for them to target those communities. Mm-hmm. You can build, in the case of Buckingham County, a compressor station in an 85% African-American neighborhood because those people aren't donating to the candidates who are running for office. Mm-hmm. They don't have the political power. They're in a rural community. They don't have the Northern Virginia media focusing on them. So it is, in fact, a form of racism, and it's not an accident, and we need to deal with that. We need to have our policymakers deal with it, and we need to change it.
I like that, yeah.
Well, I'm not saying that it's not intentional. Everything that happens when we're talking about injustice, right?
Sure.
What I'm saying is that it's not always intentional. Business people go into business to make money. Mm-hmm. And so if you're not at the table, if you're not a part of the conversation, then your interest gets left out. You're absolutely right. They go to areas where they're going to have the least amount of problems, where they know that no one is going to challenge them. They're not going to come to Norfolk because they know that you have people here who are paying attention, as the young people say, who are woke. So we're not going to just come here and do that. So they go places but they cannot go if they didn't have, like you said, the policies that allow them, because whoever's in, where they say, where I'm from, North Carolina, we say whoever's the bedfellow who's giving you that deal, is giving you that right to do that. And that's because you're serving your own interests and not that of the people. Mm-hmm. So racist policies and procedures, absolutely. There are procedures that have been put in place to benefit the people who are in the know, and they forget about. I think this environmental justice issue is also a moral issue, and we have lost one of the things that when you look at the letter from Birmingham jail by King, he had not lost his moral compass. We need leadership that understand that we need to speak for the less fortunate, and that has not happened.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes. 823-9110, 823-9110. If you have questions, if you want to get in on the conversation, please do. What are your personal environmental concerns, Hampton Roads, about your own communities? 757-823-9110. Now, greenaction.org refers to environmental racism as the institutional rules, regulations, policies, or government and or corporate decisions that deliberately target certain communities for locally undesirable land uses and lax enforcement of zoning and environmental laws, resulting in communities being disproportionately exposed to toxic and hazardous waste based upon race. So I think that wraps up everything that you guys were saying. So when we think of that, and from you guys' point of view, what are some usual or some everyday demonstrations of environmental racism that maybe we don't even think of as environmental racism until you guys told us that, yeah, that is environmental injustice?
Well, as I mentioned before, the concept of fence line communities, where if you just look around the neighborhoods that you live in, has a power plant been located there, and why was it located there as opposed to a different neighborhood, as a chemical plant, a landfill, that sort of thing. But we're also talking more broadly, about some situations that people may know a little bit about. Flint, Michigan, and the water supply there is a prime example, probably one of the most offensive examples of environmental racism in the last several years, where the water supply for 100,000 people was poisoned because decision makers, largely white, decided to save a few bucks by switching the water supply that's serviced Flint, and as a result of that, the lead in the pipes leached out and poisoned 100,000 people, including children, who are particularly vulnerable to lead poisoning. We're talking about situations like in North and South Dakota, the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation. People may have heard about this last year, the Dakota Access Pipeline, which was going to be routed through Bismarck, North Dakota, which is just to the north of the Standing Rock Reservation, and the people there, in a largely white community, objected. So they moved the pipeline to go under a reservoir that's the sole source of water for the Sioux Indians who were living there. So It's all over. Is I think the short answer to your question. It's in places large and small. It's in examples large and small, but it's a pervasive problem, and it's really one that's not being addressed properly or even at all in my estimation.
I so agree with you. With Flint, you're speaking, but I know one that's even closer to home to me. I grew up near Wilmington, North Carolina, which is not that is southeastern North Carolina. And right now we have a problem with a subsidiary of DuPont, who has poisoned the water there in Brunswick County, North Carolina. It's not getting very much press because for whatever reason, the quality people from the water quality from the state they're having these meetings. But I was home during Christmas talking to my mother, who is 87 years old, and they're not doing anything to give the people who are in that age group and that population of people. They have a lot of elders, and they were what she was asking me, and so I have a personal fight right now, trying to work with the University of North Carolina and Chapel Hill, who was part of this grant we got from the Department of Homeland Security and Old Dominion. But working on that question, how do we inform the public, and how do we get the elders in the community, and how do they know that their water is safe? So Flint, yes, I am still puzzled as to how that's not criminal. And you're a lawyer, so you should be able to address that. What they did intentionally is very criminal. And Wilmington, North Carolina, where I'm from, and I'm trying to figure out what the next steps. And I guess in some ways it's fortuitous that my mother asked me, and I looked it up, and I was just appalled about what, you used that word before, Jonathan. I was really appalled about how long this has been going on and the fact that no one seems to know about it.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. All right, 823-9110, 823-9110. We are talking about environmental racism right here on Hampton Roads Voices, a brand new episode. I have Dr. Okpudu here from Norfolk State University and John Sokolow, attorney and activist. When we return, we're going to get more into this conversation. You can look forward to how we are protected. Are we even protected from environmental racism, and what we can do about it a little bit later on in this show. Okay? Make sure you keep it locked. It's Hot 91. Hot 91, your choice for hip-hop and R&B soul. Kilo is here with a brand new episode of Hampton Roads Voices. And as always, we are bringing you topics that you probably need to talk about or never even really thought of, okay? Tonight we're talking about environmental racism. So what that basically means is that certain communities, and particularly communities of minorities, are disproportionately affected by environmental harms. Okay, so for example, here in Norfolk, sea level rise, you see most of those neighborhoods who are affected by flooding are usually communities of minorities. And like John Sokolow said, the pipeline. And who is that affecting? And then nationally, on a national scale, we saw Flint in their water crisis. So those are all examples and demonstrations of environmental racism. I have special guest experts with me today. I have Dr. Okpudu. She's a biology professor and a biologist here at Norfolk State University. And John Sokolow, he is an attorney and activist, and he has written many of articles about environmental injustices in Virginia. Okay, so was doing my research, of course, to prepare for the show, and I ran across a video. And so I have the audio from that video having to do, it's entitled The Atlantic Argument, Van Newkirk on Environmental Racism. And I thought it would be very, very helpful to kind of explain it to you guys. Don't forget, if you want to call in with a question or put your 2 cents in, you are more than welcome. 757-823-9110, 823-9110. Okay, take a listen to this.
In America, air and water are separate but unequal. Environmental racism is the new Jim Crow. Yeah, I get it. The environment isn't a person. How can it be racist? But the most basic pieces of the environment, the air we breathe and the water we drink, are controlled and designed by people. And people can be racist. More than half of all people who live close to hazardous waste are people of color. Floodplains nationwide have high populations of blacks and Hispanics. Black children are twice as likely to suffer from lead poisoning as white children. This inequality is no accident. Pollution and the risk of disaster are assigned to black and brown communities through generations of discrimination and political neglect. Enslaved Africans were commodities partly because their work carried environmental risks that were unacceptable to whites, like exposure to heat, malaria, and mosquitoes. As Jim Crow laws created racial segregation, they also reinforced an environmental system that still disadvantages minorities. It's no wonder that Black and Hispanic children have the highest rates of asthma, or that hurricanes like Katrina, Sandy, and Matthew did their worst damage in communities of color. Rich white neighborhoods can update their water pipes, but not places like Flint. The Jim Crow laws are dead and gone, but the fact that people of color are still more likely to die from environmental causes is no accident.
Again, that is the Atlantic Argument, Van Newkirk on environmental racism, okay? So that kind of puts things in perspective about what it is if you're just now tuning in. All right, so John, Dr. O, of course, we can kind of guess what the effects, what the results of these environmental injustices could do on our people, and we just heard Van Newkirk say that. But again, for people who are just learning about this, what are the obvious effects of the people that are living in these communities that are affected by environmental injustices?
So NIH actually has a whole area looking at health disparities and what it leads to when you are exposed unnecessarily to high levels of, let's say, toxins like lead or mercury. When you live, or arsenic. Some of the people live near refineries, like in New Orleans or in Louisiana. They're disproportionately exposed, as you said, because the land that's closer to those refineries, where they have chosen, the planners have chosen to put them, usually are in our backyard. One of the ones that probably brought a lot of attention was the Aaron Brockovich, that story, and looking at the Love Canal, and disproportionately poor people were dying. One of the things we have higher incidence. We can look at the epidemiological data, and you can look to see where you have these pockets of. This is probably how it became exposed in North Carolina, because they were noticing from the state health reports that there were disproportionately people dying of certain cancers, and they couldn't figure out, well, why these people are presenting with this particular cancer. So somebody actually went and started looking at the epidemiological data and trying to figure out why disproportionately these people were being affected. You can look for asthma. Asthma is one of the things that quality of life, and a lot of times the medications are used to manage this. Disproportionately, young people die because they don't have access to the healthcare system, which is another, if you ask me, another social inequity and justice that we have to talk about. That is the elephant that is in the room that is easily to capture and put back in a cage if we wanted to. And then the other thing I think about is stress. When you live in areas where there is disproportionately violence, we don't think of that as a social equity issue. I should not expect to be shot by the police if I go into Walmart and I'm assumed that I'm shoplifting, and you have no evidence, and I pay with my life. Like before, no due process. The only process is a bullet. So those are also, I think, social and environmental justice issues that we live with here in Portsmouth and Norfolk. I worry about when I walk out the door, when my students leave me. I often worry and say prayers for them that they will return, that they won't be mistaken for someone, because that's a social and environmental justice issue. And so those are the things that I see that are health disparities that lead to us disproportionately being affected. When you're under stress, you can't learn as much.
Absolutely.
If your food supply, we live in a food desert, okay?
And that is another environmental injustice.
There's not any fresh food or a grocery store. I wanted to ask the students, well, where do you get your food? And they tell me the Quickie Mart thing that's next to the university. And the university does an effort to try to provide a bus to them to go to Walmart or whatever. But I'm wondering, why don't we have grocery stores? I just learned yesterday at Newport News I always call Newport News uptown or downtown. But in the areas of Newport News where they have a high level of poverty, they just lost the only grocery store that they have in that area. So one of the things I'm helping to do with my environmental group here at Norfolk State is that for us to grow produce in the greenhouse, so that we could, give it to food banks or have, like they have in the D.C., Washington area, go out and sell produce or give produce away that we've produced.
Absolutely.
Because can't look to somebody else to solve our problems all the time because they're not interested in solving our problems. Mm-hmm. If they were, this wouldn't exist in the first place. Mm-hmm. And I'm not really interested in other people saving me. I'm not waiting for somebody on a horse to come get me. Mm-hmm. I think there's some things I can do for myself. Yeah. And so I'm sorry, John, I'm going to stop. But I'm just really passionate about this health disparity thing that I see.
I'm enjoying listening to you. No, there's absolutely no question, Dr. O, that the health effects of environmental racism are really the worst. Mm-hmm. I mean, African American children, studies show, suffer from asthma twice the rate of white children, and the death rate among African American children from asthma is 10 times what it is for white children. Wow. So, that's just one example of, and you take children like that and you put them in a fence line community and put a toxic waste dump or a chemical factory, it's going to make things so much worse. You put a compressor station that emits benzene and methane and all sorts of toxic particles into the air, it's going to make all of that worse. When they're talking about building a compressor station for a gas pipeline or some other facility, there's a phrase they use for people who live within a mile of the facility. And the phrase they use is an incineration zone. And they mean that quite literally. If a pipeline blows up, that's called the incineration zone where everything there is destroyed. So we're not talking about, in that case, devastation, physical devastation, but just the knowledge that you live in an incineration zone. What does that do to your psyche? What does that do to your property values? What does that do to your children? What does that do in terms of creating PTSD? What does that do to people wanting to move into that community and thrive in that community? It destroys a community to impose that against people's will on them. So, as I said, the health effects are the worst, but it goes far beyond that as well.
Okay. So when we think of the causes, what are the causes of environmental injustice and injustices, and are these communities deliberately targeted? I know we kind of said that earlier. We kind of tiptoed around it, but let's address it again. And before you guys answer, 757-823-9110, what are some, now that you know what environmental injustices and environmental racism is, do you think that you experience it in your community here in the Hampton Roads area? And if you do, call in and share your personal experience with these injustices and this type of systematic racism. 823-9110, 823-9110. So the causes of this. According to greenaction.org, again, they say environmental racism is caused by, quote, several factors, including intentional neglect, the alleged need for receptacle for pollutants in urban areas, and a lack of institutional power and low land values of people of color. So those are some of the causes that they say are factors in environmental racism. What do you guys say? John, we'll start with you.
Yeah, no, absolutely, I agree with that. I think there's largely an economic component to it. Obviously, as I had said earlier, it's cheaper to build the facility that you want to build if you're a big corporation in a community that can't fight back. But it I think does go beyond that. It has to do with political power. It has to do with indifference. If they wanted to build a compressor station in the middle of Arlington County in a wealthy neighborhood or in McLean, Virginia, I imagine they wouldn't be able to do it. Just like they couldn't, put a pipeline in Bismarck, North Dakota, because the community spoke out. So it has to do with indifference on the part of power brokers and the relative lack of power of some of these communities. But I also think it's important to note something else. I think Dr. O mentioned, we used the word appalling before. Dr. King, in his letter from the Birmingham jail, which is just a brilliant piece of work, 1963, said, "We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people." And I feel very strongly that none of this would be happening, these incidents that we're talking about, if good people spoke out. And there's just too much appalling silence in Virginia and across the country. They wouldn't be silent, as I said, if in the middle of white suburbia they were to build a facility that destroyed people's property values. But they're happy to let it happen in some other part of Virginia. We all live on the same planet. And if we don't stand up for each other, we'll all, perish together, as the phrase goes. So I think there's an element not just of of benign neglect. There's an element of people who should know better, not being willing to really get out there and speak up.
People that should know better. I like that.
You know, there's a book by Malcolm Gladwell that talks about the tipping point. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. And one of the things that he talks about is how do you, using an epidemiological model for how you institute change, how do you get change to happen? And as a person who likes, who's an outdoors kind of person, and one of the things I think that's a small thing that we can do, as I ride through every day, I look at the aesthetics of the community and why the city don't make a better job at curb appeal. There are things that we can do in the natural environment to help with water, for us not to have so much water retention. For example, making sure the drainage areas that you have them and that they're clean. Yeah. There are small things that we can do for mindset. But if it's like you said, if we don't value that, if we don't see the importance of it, and if we keep silent because our palms are being greased, and we don't worry about our brother, this idea that we are all family and not strangers is one that we really need to talk about.
Absolutely.
and to internalize so that we don't see it as the others, but I see that as us. Absolutely. We're the same.
I like that. 757-823-9110. I know that this topic is very different. I know it. I know it's something that a lot of people don't talk about. You maybe never have heard it before. So I'm going to take this silence of the phone calls as you guys digesting this information, learning what it is, and, trying to be informed. That is what Hampton Roads Voices is all about, presenting you with issues that you didn't even know was an issue in this community, and also providing solutions. And that's exactly where we're going to be getting into in the 6 o'clock hour. Solutions. What can we do? How can we get the people in power to do something about it, and so forth and so on. It's a brand new episode. I cannot talk this evening. This is a brand new episode of Hampton Roads Voices, Environmental Racism. Make sure you keep it locked right here. It's Hot 91. Hot 91, your choice for hip hop and R&B soul. Having a great conversation on today about environmental racism. That is actually the title of our episode, Environmental Racism. That is referring to the disproportionate harm that is happening to communities of color in regards to the environment. Okay, so like flooding, and you know what? The best example really that everybody knows about is the Flint water crisis. They just got clean water. They just got that fixed, but we know it was years that several of those citizens, I think John said earlier, 100,000, most of them, a large percent of them being African American, did not have clean water coming out of their faucets. Okay, and then I think I read an article that they still had to pay their water bill. I don't know how true that is, but the article was pretty respectable. But they still had to pay their water bill, even though the water that was coming out of their faucets, they couldn't bathe in, they couldn't wash their clothes in, they couldn't drink it. It was poisoned with lead. So that is a very great example of environmental injustice, environmental racism. And that's what we're talking about tonight with special guest experts, Dr. Okpadu, biologist of Norfolk State University, and John Sokolow. He is an attorney, an activist, and he has written many articles about environmental injustices right here in Virginia. Okay, and then we have you, Hampton Roads, 757-823-9110. You have been quiet this evening, but I know that you are just taking in that information. Maybe you're going to go see Black Panther. Woohoo, yes. But if you do have any questions about this conversation, then we will be glad to answer any questions that you have. 757-823-9110. And I have a question for you. What are some concerns in your community having to do with the environment that you see, that you are witnessing, that, it really concerns you? It really gets you going. You don't think it's fair. You think it's environmental racism. Talk to me. 823-9110. Alrighty, so we talked about the causes of environmental injustices, the direct effects, which can be health, asthma. We talked about, of course, lead poisoning. Of course, what was the other one that we talked about? Ooh, cancers, different cancers. Yes, things of that nature. But let's move on to, are we protected? Okay, so we do. Like I said, Mr. Sokolow is a attorney, so he can probably attest to this a little bit more. And of course, Dr. O, you can jump in whenever you want. But is environmental justice protected? and actually articulated in any laws, in any documents that protect the land? I mean, are we protected against environmental injustice?
Sure. Well, the simple answer to that question is, in theory, yes, and in reality, no.
Okay.
So the U.S. Constitution, of course, guarantees due process and equal protection, so that's a source of protections and a source of rights for communities that are dealing with issues of environmental racism. The Virginia Constitution, interestingly enough, has a provision that guarantees that people have clean air and clean water. It would be nice if we honored that. I don't think we are, but it's in the Virginia Constitution. And then there's a series of federal regulations and executive orders, in particular one that was signed by President Clinton in 1994 that requires all federal agencies, whenever they're doing any activity, to consider the impact on what's referred to as environmental justice communities, which is a fancy word for communities of color or poor communities. So in theory, the law requires that they review these things. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, in particular, that deals with pipelines, is required to include this as part of an analysis of the impact on environmental justice communities. The Environmental Protection Agency, same thing. So those protections are on the books, but they're not enforced. Certainly not enforced under this administration. But people need to be aware that we have those rights. We need to fight for those rights. We need to insist that the law be followed. We're not necessarily in a situation where we need to have a new law. We have laws on the books that's supposed to protect us. It's just the people who are enforcing the laws are ignoring the laws. So I think those are the sources of our protection. But the one thing that can protect us more than anything is people making some noise. I mean, that's, I think, the lesson of our history, that things don't change because you get a law on the books. Things change because people insist on their rights being protected. So I think we all need to figure out ways, large and small, we can get engaged, get active, and hold our leaders accountable.
Right. Man, we sure do look good on paper. I'll tell you that. We look great. We look great on paper. Now, John, you did say something about this administration and how, they are not executing those laws properly. So did some research, of course, and according to New Virginia Majority Communications Associate Jasmine Leeward, there was a panel discussion about environmental racism, environmental injustices, and she said the following having to do with this administration and how they rolled back the Clean Power Plan that was in place during the Obama administration. She said, quote, "By rolling back the Clean Power Plan, already 1 in 6 black children have asthma as a result of the environment that a lot of them live in. Under the umbrella of systematic racism, I think is environmental racism. It's one of the ways that racism plays out in your life. Within 1.8 miles of toxic waste dumps or an industry that causes a lot of pollutants, 50% of the population that lives in that 1.8 mile radius is African American." End quote. Something for you to think about, okay? So, did you want to piggyback on that, Dr. O?
Well, I was just thinking about it from an economic question, and I was thinking about Virginia law in the state of Virginia. I was reading that we actually are supposed to make sure people are whole. John, excuse my layman terms of the legal jargon, but to make sure that people are whole, if in a case they're displaced. And because we haven't provided them. But I only know of one case that I can think of that a city was actually sued, and that was when I first moved here, when Portsmouth sued. The people were being disproportionately removed from their housing. I think it was Fairmont or something like that, Fairmont Housing. And are you familiar with this case, John?
No, not specifically.
But they used this idea, and they actually forced the city of Portsmouth to make sure that they provided them adequate housing. That, according to Virginia law, they were entitled to that. That was part of our civil liberties that we have for the state of Virginia. I think Virginia is a commonwealth, and it took me a while to get used to some of the things that we do here. Like we have a constitutional right to have, we make sure that people can't mess with our guns, but we don't make sure that we keep the air clean.
Right.
So
interesting, right?
It's very interesting the juxtaposition of those two ideas. So I'm sorry. Go ahead, John.
I was going to say one of the ways you see this played out is right now with the two pipelines that are being proposed for Virginia, the Atlantic Coast and the Mountain Valley Pipeline. Mm-hmm. Those companies have sued hundreds of landowners whose land would be impacted, in many cases destroyed by the pipeline going through, because when you're putting a pipeline through, you're not talking about just burying something under the ground. You're talking about having a 100-foot or 150-foot wide easement pathway and destroying everything there and then burying the pipeline there. So, the law requires, again, one of these things on paper, just compensation. Well, if you live on a piece of land that's been in your family since the 1850s, if you're, in the case of Buckingham County, the descendants of freedmen who settled that land, what's just compensation for destroying your land? Amen. What's just compensation for destroying unmarked graves that your ancestors were buried in on that land? Our laws are not adequate, I think, to the task, and they're certainly not being enforced in a way that is beneficial to people.
Yeah, I know that that pipeline that's coming, I think, is from Allegheny all the way down to North Carolina, isn't it? That one, the pipeline that goes from the mountains.
Yeah.
So there's like several national forests. And as a plant biologist, there are natural resources that we're going to destroy, and they haven't even given any idea of how you mitigate any of the problems that they're probably going to create. Yeah. And I find that very fascinating. Now that we have a weakening of the EPA policies for making sure that we preserve and do some, for every tree we tear down, we plant some more, because if we don't realize that the trees become very important for holding the soil. And as we just saw in California, when you start doing that, you lead to mudslides. There's other environmental things that we need to think about. Yeah. We also can contaminate the water very easily. And that the aquifers that are there, we're not getting any more water, folks. What we have, this is it. Blue marble, mm-hmm. And so what we do comes back to us. And what they do over in the rest of the world, the trade winds have shown, they come right back to your door. So this is not just a Virginia question or a regional question. This is an international question. And that's why I think that when we take ourselves out of agreements, which kind of bothers me, one great example, I'm not going to belabor the point, but I think it's a good example, how we got to the metric system and the whole world decided it's because if you use U.S. fluid ounces, you get less of a product than if you use British fluid ounces. But if you use the metric system, we all get the same amount. Right. And so I think but that came from a Paris Agreement in the 1800s. And so when we need to have these world conversations, because this planet, we're interconnected, and whatever they decide to do, and I took students for the last 10 years to India and China and Egypt so that they could have a global perspective that we're all interconnected. And what they may do and decide to put in a pesticide or whatever in a country comes back to affect us. Absolutely, yeah. So it's not environmental justice for Norfolk or Virginia. It's a worldview. We need to have a global view of this issue.
Absolutely.
And I think it's very, very important, Hampton Roads, that we know our rights. People tell you that all the time. And when we think about that, we think about only about, what the police can do, what they can't do in regards to that. But we need to know our rights in regards to your land, what they can and cannot do. And kudos to those residents who, were suing because they knew what they could and could not do. So, John, I think you were about to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a word on top of that about Norfolk in particular. Dr. O mentioned the concept of mitigation. So it turns out that we found out a couple of weeks ago that back in December, Virginia signed a series of secret agreements with Dominion Energy and the other pipeline companies to cap their damages in the event of damage done by the pipelines, in particular to not only damage to the forest, but damage to water resources. In fact, the agreement uses the word direct or indirect impacts on water resources for a fixed fee, which, if you think about it, is an outrageous idea. It's a concept of you hire a contractor to do an improvement on your home, and you limit the amount the contractor is liable for before he walks in the door. It's a crazy thing to do, but Virginia did it on December 28th, when nobody was paying attention. And this is particularly troublesome for Norfolk, because the Norfolk City Council right now is considering whether to allow the Atlantic Coast Pipeline to tunnel under the Lake Prince and the Western Branch reservoirs in Suffolk, which serve the city of Norfolk. So aside from the question of do you want a gas pipeline pressurized with incredibly high pressure going under your water supply, what happens if it bursts? What happens if they're damaged? Because under these secret agreements, Virginia has said to Dominion Energy and the other companies that are partnering with Dominion with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, you get a get-out-of-jail-free card. You've paid us all you're going to pay us and no more. So, this is something I suspect you're going to be hearing more about, but people need to contact the Norfolk City Council, which has not approved this particular piece of the project. I think they've tabled it 2 or 3 times. People need to contact your city councilman and say, don't let them build that pipeline there, if for no other reason, because if something happens, the residents of the city are going to have to pay for it because Dominion Energy, because of these secret agreements, will not.
Wow.
Well, I was just wondering, John, do you have any insight? Because I'm going to go look this up. I wasn't aware that it was signed. But oftentimes the feasibility studies that they have to do with the fact that this is a shipping lane and the fact that we have the military, in particular the Navy here, and just trying to figure out where those stakeholders considered in that agreement that was signed on December 28th.
No, there's no mention of that at all. They're not. I've read the agreements myself several times, and they're not mentioned at all.
Wow.
Norfolk is really on the front lines of this. Not just with the reservoirs. They're on the front lines because they're close to sea level.
Yeah.
They're predicting, I think, a 1.5-foot increase in sea level over the next 20 to 30 years in Norfolk. If you have a storm surge, you just need to look at footage of Hurricane Katrina or one of the other hurricanes to see what happens to a community like that. And the reason these things are happening is because of climate change. So we all have a vested interest, and Norfolk in particular, to moving to clean, renewable sources of energy and not investing in infrastructure. They talk about natural gas as if it's, you win the argument by labeling it. So natural gas sounds all natural, like you go into Whole Foods. It produces methane, which actually produces more damage to the ozone layer than coal. And these 2 pipelines that they want to build in Virginia, the studies show would produce enough damage and pollution equivalent to 42 coal-fired plants. So there's nothing clean about it. What it is dirty energy, which is going to put Norfolk in greater damage much sooner of going underwater, which is going to get back to what we were talking about, affecting communities of color and really, destroying people's lives. So.
And, of course, if this is affecting Norfolk, then you better believe Chesapeake, you better believe Portsmouth, Hampton, Newport News, all of these cities that are very close together are going to be affected as well. Let's take a break here, and usually at the end of the show, we share contact information, events, or anything like that. But let's do it now just in case somebody is getting out of the car. So any events that you have coming up, Dr. O or John, or websites, articles people should go to, or anything like that, shoot.
So we have an event coming up on February 20th, Tuesday, from 1:30 to 3:30. And the Student Center, room 307, here on the campus of the Norfolk State University. We're going to have a panel on the Maxwell Bempong Environmental Memorial Lecture, where we talk about how do we educate our students to go into these jobs, to be prepared for the global environmental market. It's a panel discussion. We've invited people from the faith community, because Creation Care is a big movement in the faith community. And we've Dr. Bernadette Holmes, a sociology professor here in Norfolk State, and my collaborator is going to be there. We've invited activists from the community, one from Portsmouth, Mr. Gary Harris, who has this idea of eco communities. Eco district is what he calls his group. And so it's going to be, it's free and open to the public. We would really, really like for you to come and continue this discussion. We also have a website. If you want to go to our website, it's www.nsu.edu/ICCAE, and you can go and get updated information on our Intelligence Community Center and the things that we're doing. Also, I make a plea. I need your help. one of the things I mentioned earlier is that we need to study ourselves. So one of the things I've gotten with DHS, Department of Homeland Security, is I've developed a survey with Old Dominion University and University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and we are trying to get a perspective from the African American community. In particular, our focus group is Portsmouth. I have reached out to churches. I haven't heard back from. I've heard from one or two, but if you're in the listening audience and you think that you can help us, please give me an email at iccae@nsu.edu.
One more time.
iccae@nsu.edu. And just let me know that you're interested. I need some people from Portsmouth. I need your help because we should be studying this issue. You are part of our stakeholder community, and we need to make sure that we're doing the right thing by you. As I said, we're all part of the same family. No strangers, all family. And so we want to be able to get your input. So, and if you want to call, 757-823-8957. 757-823-8957.
And I'll get that information from you in text so we can put that on our Facebook page.
Thank you.
All right, WNSB High 91.1 FM. John, how can we find you? Anything coming up? What do you have for us?
Well, you can find me. Anybody's free to send me an email. My email address is John Sokolow. That's JONSOKOLOW 1984 @gmail.com. I don't have any specific events coming up. I do encourage people to contact the Norfolk City Council on the point that I made earlier. Mm-hmm. But I do have some suggested reading if people want to learn more about this. 3 different sources, which I'll just quickly go through. The NAACP did a fabulous study in November of 2017 on the health impacts of air pollution from oil and gas facilities on African American communities. The title of their work is Fumes Across the Fence Line. And it's just chock full of information, historical information, and health information about how fence line communities are affected by environmental racism. And then a shameless plug, if people are interested in learning more about Buckingham County and Union Hill situation I talked about with the Atlantic Coast Pipeline compressor station in an 85% African-American community. I've written a couple articles on that. That appeared in both the Huffington Post and in a fabulous little publication in Virginia called Blue Virginia. The titles of those articles are Environmental Racism and the Appalling Silence of the Good People, and then an earlier article which is Echoes of a Dark Past at Virginia's Standing Rock, the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which talks about the origin of this compressor station, the history of the Union Hill, Buckingham County community, and suggestions about what we all can do to get engaged and get that issue as a front burner issue, because right now it's not even on the back burner, unfortunately.
Okay. Sounds good. We're going to put his information on our Facebook as well, WNSB High 91.1 FM. We do have some more show to go, about 10 more minutes, and then, 10, 15 more minutes, and then we'll wrap it up. But we're going to be talking about what we can do. So John has told us that we can contact our city councils, but what exactly, going into detail what we can do. Also, John, in one of his articles having to do with some environmental injustices like the pipeline in Virginia, he refers to an appalling silence from good people. What does he mean by that? We'll get into that coming up in a bit. It's Hampton Rose Voices, a brand new episode entitled Environmental Racism, right here on Hot 91. Hot 91, your choice for hip hop and R&B soul. It's a brand new episode of Hampton Rose Voices, and we're talking about environmental racism. What a conversation. I have learned a lot this week and last week doing my research. I always knew about environmental racism, but as like every show, I do these shows so I can learn, because if I'm learning, then I know the listeners are learning. And I'm so grateful to have special guest experts who are really putting in the fight for this and doing their due diligence to try to get justice in an environmental way. We have Dr. Okpodu here, biology professor and a biologist here at Norfolk State University, and John Sokolow. He is an attorney and an activist, and he has written many articles about the environmental injustices that we are experiencing right now in Virginia. Yes, there are some going on right now. So, John, you had mentioned this pipeline, of course, in the conversations that we have been having. But can you make it hit home a little more? Of course, this show is based out of the 757 Hampton Roads area in Norfolk, to be exact. So how is this pipeline going to affect us here in these 7 cities?
Well, it's going to affect you in a lot of ways. The pipeline is 600 miles long. It's starting in West Virginia if they build it, and we're hoping they won't, and end in North Carolina, although they're talking about extending it to South Carolina as well. But then there's a spur that goes east through Southampton counties, Suffolk, Chesapeake, Norfolk, under the reservoirs, as I mentioned, that serve the city of Norfolk. So it's going through, if it's built, all of those communities in that part of the state. So we're talking about construction damage. We're talking about the potential for leaks, the potential for explosions. The data shows that it's not a question of if these pipelines will leak. They do leak. There's thousands of leaks over the years. This is compressed methane gas, so we're talking about the potential for explosions. We're talking about pollution to the reservoirs, pollution to our aquifers. We're talking about pollution to the air. If you live in Norfolk, if you live in Chesapeake, if you live in Southampton, any of those communities, these pipelines will leak methane. Methane is toxic. Methane aggravates asthma, causes a lot of other health effects. So it's going to hit people in a very real way. And then beyond that, as I mentioned earlier, it's a question of do we want to invest in another fossil fuel that's going to put Norfolk more underwater? For our kids and our grandkids, if we keep investing in these fuels which are going to increase climate change and cause sea levels to rise, Norfolk will be underwater in our children's lifetime. So it affects people in a very real way, not just down the line, but right now, because if they're built, as I said, they will leak methane, and people will be breathing it, people will be smelling it, people will be poisoned by it, and it's something that people should be concerned about because it has a lot of terrible health effects.
Absolutely, and I think, people of this area are aware. I believe I saw some protests going on in around South Norfolk, which is a part of Chesapeake, and they were protesting the building of that particular pipeline. Yeah. So about bringing it home, the pipeline is not our only concern here. We have sea level rise, and we've been discussing it, and I know that you're doing a proposal about that, Dr. O. So can you make it hit home for us, and then I'll follow up because I have some stats as well. Make it hit home for us.
Well, what he just said, I just want to say ditto, because if the sea level, we are already, just by a normal rain event, we see the evidence of flooding and in this area. So to add more gases to the environment to cause problems with the melting of the polar ice caps, it comes down residually to us, and we're already below sea level. We're above. The only difference between us right now and what happened with Katrina is we haven't had an event. Exactly. But this is why I think mitigation, you put the time to prepare for war is in a time of peace. You don't wait to get into the situation. So we have to be more proactive. I don't like reactionary things. We definitely have to have strategies. And if you're the person that is happening to, one way to take back your power, I'm reclaiming my time, as Maxine said. We need to reclaim what's ours. And as I read that poem from Langston Hughes, this is our responsibility, all. We need to step forward and say what we are going to do. So if you want to be a part of the solution, one way of doing that is letting your voice be heard, participate in the forums that we have here, talk to us as the university so that we can know that we have stakeholders. We're servants, we're public servants, those of us who are working here at state institutions. We're here, land-grant universities and state universities here to serve public interests. So this is one thing that's really important to the constituents here. You have to be involved. And so I think it's home. It's in your backyard. Yeah. This is the only area we have, and we have to make sure that the vulnerable populations are spoken for. Absolutely. Those of us, like Du Bois said, those of us who are part of the talented 10th, we have the ability to make sure that the other 90% is taken care of. And
to make it hit home a little bit more, this information is it was a case study. It's called Tidal Turmoil, Environmental Justice and Sea Level Rise in Hampton Roads. And it was done by Michael Boyer. He's a law school graduate and a part of the Virginia Coastal Policy Clinic at William and Mary Law School, and also Erica Penn, a third-year law student and also part of Virginia Coastal Policy Clinic at William and Mary Law School. And they put together a very great case study. I read it, but one of they had a table with statistics and percentages that really took me aback. So they compared Norfolk to New Orleans, and I've always said, just by the rain, like we've been saying, when it rains right down the street from Norfolk State, trying to get home, the city literally looks like it's underwater. You cannot drive your car through some of these roads, so it's alarming. We're living in it right now, and we saw the devastation to New Orleans. That same thing, the very thing can happen to Norfolk. So just looking at the African American population to kind of put it into not layman's terms, but kind of put it in front of your face. So the African American population in Louisiana, as like the state, is 32.4%. In New Orleans is 60.2% of African Americans. In Virginia, 19.4%. In Norfolk alone is 43.1% African American population. How many of those live below the poverty line? I'm just going to give you the Virginia and Norfolk statistics. 10% in the state of 10.7%. Can't leave out the 0.7. In the state of Virginia live below the poverty line. And then in Norfolk, 17.1% of people live underneath the poverty line. And then the home ownership rate, because that's a big one. I think Dr. O said that as far as She may have said it off of air, but when you don't own your home, you don't really have much say when your house is underwater. You know, your landlord may not want to do the necessary things to kind of keep you afloat. So 68.4% of African Americans own their home in Virginia. I'm sorry, they don't own their home. And then 46.4% in Norfolk. Okay? All righty. So really quick, John, you said something about an appalling silence in the state of Virginia in regards to environmental racism. You said a lot of good people are silent. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Well, sure. So first, the good news. In the last election in November,
yes,
we elected 15 or 16 new delegates to the House of Representatives, or to the House of Delegates in Virginia, a diverse, very diverse group, progressives, and many of them refuse to take money from Dominion Energy. Many of them are against the pipeline. We elected Justin Fairfax as lieutenant governor, second African American in the history of Virginia to be elected to statewide office. So there's lots of good news. And Lieutenant Governor Fairfax in particular came out against the pipelines as part of his campaign and refused to take money from Dominion Energy. So that's the good news. The bad news is people are not speaking out enough. There's just not enough press coverage. A lot of that has to do with the legislators in both parties continue to take money from Dominion and refuse to speak about any of these issues. And that includes Democrats as well, people who I'd refer to as good people who many of us agree with on many other issues. But on this particular issue, for a variety of reasons, mostly having to do with the power of Dominion Energy, people are shy about making some noise, and that needs to change. As I said, it's the pipelines in general. It's Buckingham County in particular, an 85% African American community that's going to be destroyed. And the way I think of it, in one of my articles, I just ended it this way, and it sums it up for me. We all breathe air, we all drink water, and we are all Union Hill. Union Hill being the community in Buckingham County, so where this pipeline compressor station is going to be. So people need to speak out. I think there's too many good people who want to say these pipelines are a fait accompli and they're not willing to speak out. That needs to change, and it needs to change soon.
So that's a good segue. So what exactly, and you guys have been telling us all show long, but what exactly can we do? So even if me, who I live in Western Branch area, so I'm not affected by sea level rise, or I'm not affected by being next to a power plant, but I care. So residents like me who are not affected directly, but will be indirectly, and those residents who are living in those certain communities, what can we do? Are we helpless? What exactly should we be doing?
Well, there's lots that we should be doing. I don't want to cut into Dr. O there, but contact your state representative, contact your city council member. As I said, if you live in Norfolk, contact your Norfolk City Council member and tell them to not let these pipelines go in under the reservoir. Contact your state legislator and ask them to speak out on these secret agreements that cap what Dominion Energy will pay if there's damage to the water in Virginia. Send them emails. Call your representative. It's amazing. The elected officials like to pretend that people's noise doesn't make a difference. It does make a difference, particularly with state officials who may not get a lot of phone calls. So if they get 5 or 6 phone calls from people who are in their community, they are more likely to respond, because 5 or 6 people can reach a lot of people, and in a small election district could make a difference next time around. So there's lots people can do. Get active on social media, educate yourself on the issues, and call your elected representatives and demand that they do something about this issue, because, as I said, it affects everybody.
I agree with all of those things and all those points, but I would advocate that you get involved at a grassroots level. That there are a number of organizations that are here in the Hampton Roads area that are environmental conscious groups who and they're interested in EJ. I am not going to try to name all of them, but what I will do is give you the list that I have who are actually focused on this issue of equity and justice. I know of only one, the Eco District, because I've been working with them in Portsmouth, but I know there are many. I know there are a number of coalitions that have been established. I'm thinking of a young lady named Mariah Davis, who has now moved to Annapolis, Maryland, but she was one of the people who came down from the Virginia Commission, who came on the environment and came to Norfolk State and did a presentation for us at our 13th annual Bimpong lecture. So there are a number of social groups that you can get. Anyone is welcome to come to the university and participate in any of our SEEDS activities, which is a strategic method for getting people interested in the environment. We're trying to institute the community garden. We're also trying to do some beautification things here in Norfolk. One of the things we haven't talked about, and Dr. Holmes, I hope she'll mention it, because I don't know if people realize this, but the Botanical Garden that's here in Norfolk has a history that came from us. It would not exist if it wasn't for the African American community here. And so I know her mother was one of the workers for the WPA program that was put in place. So make sure you ask her that when she comes here. Yeah. But there are a number of opportunities that you can get involved, no pun intended, at the grassroots level, so that you can help the environment. And let your voice be heard. One small voice is enough to start a movement. Rosa Parks decided not to move because she was sick and tired, as Fannie Lou said. Sick and tired of being sick and tired. Once we get a critical mass, a number of people moving with the same voice, then we have to be heard. They can't ignore us. And as Jonathan pointed out, that congressional people and people who are in government positions do listen to us. They don't want us saying, they want to do well. Yes. Most people are into this because of public service, and they want to serve their constituents.
Let's get loud. Okay. I know sometimes we as African Americans, we feel as though everything is against us, but this is not the time to get tired. This is just as important as police brutality, and just as important as other forms of systematic racism. We have to make some noise, like our special guest experts have told us. And let's start by contacting our state legislation, our state representatives, our national representatives that are in the House of Delegates and in Congress and things of that nature. And of course, like Dr. O says, the grassroots level. I know our time is very limited, but if you attend one forum here or attend a meeting here and, give financially, it's just many things that we can do. Okay, one more time, guys, if you can throw out your contact information and, of course, your event one more time, Dr. O, that'd be great.
So February 20th, here at Norfolk State University in the Student Center, room 307, from 1:30 to 3:30. If you want to reach me, my phone number is 757-823-8957, or you're welcome to email me at iccae@nsu.edu.
And John?
And my email address, anybody's free to contact me, is John Sokolow, that's JONSOKOLOW, 1984 @gmail.com.
Thank you both for having this conversation. It was very much needed. I had fun. Had fun learning. And I think to be a well-rounded individual, you have to be aware of different things. Environmental racism here, social justice over there, which is a form of that. And, you know, I'm having fun learning these things during Black History Month. So thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for tuning in, Hampton Roads. Last week's episode of Hampton Roads Voices Blackface is now on our YouTube channel. So won't you subscribe? Subscribe. I know you're getting in and out of your cars and you can't catch everything, but that's what YouTube is for. Hampton Roads Voices is what we are on YouTube. And this will be on our YouTube channel later on in the week. Okay. Thank you for listening. Don't forget, we are rebroadcasting this episode on Sunday. And, yeah, see you later. It's Hot 81. The views and opinions expressed on this program are not those of Norfolk State University or WNSB FM. Thank you for listening.